We're in the midst of a devastating pandemic. The coronavirus that leads to COVID-19 is known to be a zoonotic disease, a virus that has spilled over from non-human animals to humans and then rapidly moved across the world with devastating impacts on human health, economies, and social stability. What is the connection between environmental change and diseases such as coronaviruses? How strong is this connection? Can we really blame bats? And what does the future of disease risks look like? Today, we will talk to Professor Kate Jones from University College London and my colleague, Dr. Peter Søgaard Jørgensen from Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Welcome to Rethink Talks. Hi, Peter.
Hello.
Thanks for joining. Hi, Kate, joining us from London. Thanks so much for being here, virtually at least. And thanks, Peter, for being here.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
So people probably don't know you. So why don't you just very briefly introduce yourselves? Who you are, what kind of work do you do? Kate, do you want to go first?
Yes, thanks for the invitation to come and chat. I'm a Professor of Ecology and Biodiversity at University College London. And I'm really interested in the links between human health and well-being and planetary health, so ecological health, health of nature and of the climate.
Thanks, Kate. Peter, what about you?
Yeah, I'm a researcher here in Stockholm and Deputy Director of the Global Economic Dynamics and the Biosphere Academy program at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre.
Great. Thanks. All right, but let's dig deeper into this issue. I mean, the issue for today is health, epidemics, environmental change, global change. And I know, Kate, I mean, you made this brilliant study that was published 2008 in Nature. And you showed that, and I'm quoting a little bit, that emerging infectious disease events, such as SARS and Ebola, are dominated by zoonosis, so 60% of these, and the majority originate in wildlife. And I know a lot of people argue that the risks that we're seeing here, like such as the coronavirus, has links to environmental change in some form, like deforestation, biodiversity loss, habitat loss. Can you help us unpack this a little bit, Kate? Like, what is the relationship between environmental change and diseases such as coronavirus?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's an ongoing area of study. But if I just kind of segue into the pathways of how pathogens travel between animals and people first, then you can kind of understand the links between the environment and emergence of these new diseases. So there's a huge variety of ways which pathogens get from animals to people. So if you briefly think about like a pathogenic organism, like a virus or bacteria or a fungi, you've got a lot of options on how you get from animals to people. So in the simplest case, an animal transmits a pathogen directly to a human via, for example, food or contaminated water in feces or urine, or it could be through direct bodily fluid contact or inhaled airborne particles. So an example of that would be, say, Lassa fever in West Africa. So that the host is a rat and it's an agricultural pest, and that kind of contact with animals and people is the way it gets in. But then, there are more complex patterns, so that there might be a domestic animal that amplifies this pathogen transmission as well. So, for example, Nipah virus, which emerged in Malaysia in 1999, that had a domestic pig kind of amplifying host. It was an intermediary between the reservoir wildlife host and then the farmers, which are the humans. So the kind of interaction there was with domestic species, and the evidence suggests that domestic species can play an important role here. And then you've got vectors, transmitters of the diseases like arthropods, like insects, and they can act as a way of getting from the animals into people. So that Rift Valley fever, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa is like that. There's wildlife, domestic species vectors and humans involved. And then some of these vector-borne diseases can just become purely human to human, like malaria or dengue fever. So just to emphasize, though, that the majority of these pathogens don't do anything to us. They can't get in. We've got huge lines of defenses. So getting in is very difficult. And then once you're inside, you can cause an infection. Sometimes most diseases don't cause anything to happen. And then a small, tiny proportion, and you probably know all the names of them, like Ebola, SARS, MERS, SARS-2, cause replication within the human and the pathogen to go human to human. So those are incredibly rare. So when you think about all those transmission pathways, back to your original question, if you change the dynamics between these pathways, right, animals and people, if you change those pathways by environmental degradation, for example, or intensification of agriculture, you're changing the kind of proportion of probability of contact between people and humans. So anything that changes the transmission dynamics changes the risk that we'll get a spillover.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of focus, at least in the public discourse, around illegal wildlife trade and wet markets. How important is that type of trade with animals compared to these other bigger changes that you talk about? Agriculture.
Yeah, I think that's another really interesting question. I think wet markets can describe a huge variety of trading venues. So wet market is what I have in Muswell Hill in London on a Sunday morning, right? It's a farmer's market which provides fresh food for people in cities and in urban areas. So I think what the concern really has been around the wild animal part of those wet markets, and I would really say that there's a lot of demonization of those markets at the moment, and I think they provide a huge amount of cultural, socioeconomic stability to some of those regions, and actually we should be thinking about biosecurity measures to improve the biosecurity of those areas. There's no doubt that they do play a role, but I just don't know how important it is one point of contact versus, say, the whole of the region. So farming and human activity in those, perhaps just starting to turn into agricultural regions. So, for example, for the Wuhan market case, there was so much pre-exposure of the humans to wildlife pathogens across that landscape. So it's debatable whether the actual market was the actual source. It could have been an amplifier, for example. So I think it's very complicated, and we shouldn't demonize things from our position in the West about how people are surviving.
Before going over to you, Peter, I mean, since you bring this up, Kid, this issue about uncertainties and unknowns, I mean, I saw this statement from the UN environmental chief that says nature is sending us a message through this pandemic. But I'm thinking, like, how loud and clear is this message really? What are some of these major uncertainties about the connections between environmental or social ecological change and disease as you see it?
Sorry, was that to me?
Yes.
The uncertainties are exactly how those relationships work with degradation. So we don't really understand that. So I think we need a better link to the effects of land use and climate change to these pathways. And it could be that there's one universal general mechanism, like more impact onto the system, decrease the biodiversity present, and you get more hosts which are capable of transmitting the pathogen. And then you've got a higher hazard, which then turns into a higher exposure to the humans. They're maybe more susceptible, and then you've got a higher risk. But we don't know that for certain. So I think we need to understand these links better. So there's uncertainty about the effect of degradation and different habitat degradation types and the how that impacts each pathway for each disease. We also don't understand really what makes something go from being in its wildlife host, which is perfectly normal, to then going into a human. So what makes it more virulent or more possible to get through the human barrier? And then from there, what makes it go from human to human?
I mean, there's something here, and I want to bring in Peter here as an expert. I mean, you study the implications of evolution for the biosphere and in society, for sustainability in general. I mean, what is the role of evolution in this pandemic as you see it? And if you think about a little bit into the future, what does it mean for the coronavirus?
Yeah, I think Kate did an extraordinary job in highlighting the complexity of emerging infectious diseases. And like all other species or biological units, they are a product of evolution. So obviously evolution has something to do here. But I'd like to take a step back and go back to what Kate talked about when we talk about the land use changes there. And that's itself a result of an evolutionary process that has taken place over centuries, where humans have domesticated animals, right? They've become part of our own ecological systems that we have in our cities, in our production ecosystems. And those systems are now dominated by a few species that we have cultivated and become very successful. And that's one role of evolution in emerging infectious diseases, the whole domestication process, right? But actually once an emerging infectious disease, there's an outbreak of that, evolution have often taken place already. So I think that's sometimes a misunderstanding, but there's not much evidence in this case that SARS-2 has evolved very rapidly, very recently, at least not so far. But evolution is just taking place all the time in the environment, in nature, and just new interactions are sitting there waiting to happen. And sometimes, and in very few cases, as Kate mentioned, it happens to be a pathogen that is very bad for humans that makes this jump into our ecosystem. So that's one role of evolution. But I think maybe more importantly is the evolution that is happening in terms of ideas, practices, and technology in our own society right now being implicated by this pandemic, right? And we're seeing massive change in society right now in response to the pandemic. And so obviously a lot of work to do there in understanding these changes, and I studied them from an evolutionary angle. Many people study them from other perspectives, but maybe that's actually the most important thing right now to do work on, right? Is to understand how we're changing in terms of our social norms. We're having, social distancing like we've never seen before, and changing patterns how we relate to each other, how we relate to the living world. Are we going to see sort of a biophobia emerge after this? We don't know. At the same time, some people are hiding out in nature, right? And finding that's actually sort of, they are more safe there in this current situation. So is that going to provide some opportunity for reconnection to other types of ecosystems? I think there's so much happening right now that we need to understand.
I think one of the ways that we should go forward in trying to understand risk is trying to really think about it in a systems dynamic framework. So change is happening to all parts of these pathways. So can we kind of take a leaf out of the climate change people, like you guys have done a lot of work on this, but you've got these risk frameworks where you think about the hazard, you think about the exposure, and you think about the susceptibility. Can we apply that to these diseases and think about how change operates on each one part of that, so that we get a much more nuanced and system-specific understanding of each disease, and then trying to forecast that. So I think that would be really helpful, and actually very possible to do that at a global scale, to start to think about, well, how can we predict the next disease? I don't think it's that hard, actually. I think it's more like we haven't got a kind of global system or any mechanism which to feed into and do these analyses and feed into policymakers making decisions.
If you're a politician or the administrator of the Public Health Agency in Sweden, you don't have the opportunity to wait for all the information to come in 10 years' time or something. You have to act now, right? In this uncertainty. So that's that's a lot of decision making to be made on a very thin layer of information there. So.
I mean,
and you're a political scientist, Victor.
Yeah,
you might have some.
I have lots of things to say about that, but not today. No, but I'm thinking about this. I mean, again, I mentioned this paper and global analysis that you did in 2008, Kate. And thinking about that now, 12 years later, would you say that some of the results have changed, or the new insights now, 2020, compared to 2008, in terms of new drivers of risk or new geographical places where vulnerabilities or risks are higher now compared to before?
I would say that the 2008 paper was a real milestone in throwing down the gauntlet. I think it was kind of throwing down the gauntlet to let's have a think about this on a global scale, and can we make some mechanistic predictions about what's going to happen? And I think it was a great stimulus for disease ecologists worldwide to start to think about this more broadly. So I think our understanding has changed significantly for the better over the last few decade or so. I think we now understand that these correlative approaches, although useful in that paper, need to be kind of the pathways and the mechanisms need to be understood if you're going to make it truly predictive. So I think there's been a lot of progress on understanding generalized patterns of pathways between different types of pathogens and humans. I think that's been a really big leap. There's also understanding that not all species are the same, so some species are more risky than others. And also kind of just understanding a bit more about how land use change and climate change might impact different host species. So there is uncertainty, but I think we've made huge amount of progress. And I'd give another paper of mine as an example, not to blow my own trumpet, etc. But we looked at Ebola with a project with you, actually. We looked at Ebola and tried to understand whether we could make predictive models of Ebola. And Ebola is, not to be morbid, but it's an absolutely fascinating disease, and it's caused huge amounts of distress and death across sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. But it's a fascinating disease, and there's a wildlife host, and then there's human-to-human transmission. And so trying to understand how to model that has been really interesting and eye-opening, so that you can't, there's only actually been like 20 or so outbreaks of Ebola. So if you were taking a correlative approach to predicting where those would be in the future, you've only got 26 data points across all of sub-Saharan Africa. So that's not going to work. You're just going to model error. But if you can think about the pathways and then start to use that kind of mechanistic framework, but then put in remote sensing data to parameterize your knowledge and your model, and then use kind of understanding of how Ebola goes from humans to humans and where the transport networks are, and how global change is going to impact the hosts and also the people and the different scenarios of global change and land use change. Then you're talking, you can start to think about what's the risk surface. So that's exactly what we did in this new paper we published last year. And we did the modelling, a year or so ago, because it took so long. And we predicted the outbreaks in DRC as areas of really high vulnerability. And that's a kind of good example of how to link this to policy. If you're understanding the mechanisms, understanding a broad suite of scenarios in which global change is happening, and then giving policymakers an idea of where the really risky areas, the areas where if something emerged, it's got a higher likelihood of going, having a really serious impact, really serious outbreak. So I think something like that, but we could start to do that for a number of different diseases, but also thinking about the risky, say, coronaviruses. which have got human potential spread. So, there are complexities, and I don't want to minimize that, but I think we've made a huge advance in the last few years, and then we're starting to unpick these mechanisms in order to then make predictive models. So I think, I honestly don't think it's that hard anymore to make these general predictive frameworks. I think what's hard is the political bit of it now. I think it's about, where does this fall? Who's in charge of this? It's about ecology, it's about land use change, it's about climate change, but basically it's about public health. And so how do you get the public health people and the ecologists to talk to each other in a joined up way? And it falls awkwardly between two fields, really. And who's in charge of this? Who's in charge of implementing it?
I mean, speaking of health risks and healthcare, and going back to this part on evolution, I mean, something that is really on the agenda at the moment now, Peter, is antibiotic resistance and COVID-19. Can you elaborate that a little bit? What is the connection between COVID-19 and antibiotic resistance?
Yeah, absolutely. So antibiotic resistance, I think, has received more attention the last 10 years, but especially the last 5 years. And actually, for a moment, it felt like it was kind of being overshadowed by this pandemic, like everything else, right? And I think there's still some risk, actually, that it will. But recently, in connection with WHO releasing a new report from the global surveillance system on antimicrobial resistance, I mean, we are seeing these increasing trends in resistance. That's from before the outbreak. But the WHO is concerned that all these viral infections in some places are being treated with antibiotics, even though that's not necessary, and that's going to increase resistance in the long run. So that's one link there. I mean, and we know from other studies, like in the US, every year when you have the flu season, antibiotic use goes up. So that's a well-known, and so especially in countries with poorly regulated sales, I mean, that's few diagnostics. That's likely going to happen again this time, and probably will increase antibiotic resistance as well. A second link, or speculative link, that some people have made is in terms of mortality rates in some countries. So people have speculated that countries in some southern European countries with high background levels of antibiotic resistance, maybe the reason that they are experiencing higher mortality rates is because when you get infected with a viral infection, you may get a co-infection with a bacteria, and just because you have resistance, you have less opportunity for getting rid of that. So those are the possible links, but let's see what happens in the future. I think one thing I want to highlight there is how also different these things are in their nature, right? Antibiotic resistance is this kind of slow-moving thread that is where you see slowly increasing rates of resistance over decades, and suddenly we are kind of maybe crossing a tipping point where we see pan-resistance. We don't have any antibiotics that work for some species. Outbreaks of emerging infectious diseases like these zoonoses, like COVID or Ebola, are very different, right? And if we think about from a resilience perspective, these are kind of shocks that happen to the system, and they always go unexpected and spread. And so they really speak to two different kinds of resilience in society in terms of how we can live with the biosphere. We both need these capacities for responding rapidly to sudden outbreaks, but also in terms of dealing with threats like climate change and antibiotic resistance, that are these slow-moving things, but that once they're moving, they're really hard to slow down again. So some lessons there, I think. And also if you compare like Ebola to the COVID outbreak, I mean, there are some reasons why Ebola and also the first SARS outbreak were easier to contain, right? I mean, because they were so lethal. It's not the most lethal diseases that are necessarily the biggest challenge in the long run. COVID is both fascinating and intimidating in terms of its resilience. I mean, it can infect the upper respiratory tract. It can infect the lungs. Many people go unnoticed, so it's these hidden dynamics. A lot of things to learn about there and think about in terms of how we as society can cope with these kind of hidden challenges and hidden dynamics.
But I'm thinking that, I mean, this issue is very much related to issues around social resilience. And what we've seen here during the pandemic is that this pandemic is not at all the great equalizer, as some people have talked about it, at least in the beginning. I mean, there's some very deep issues about social inequality and poverty. Would you mind exploring that a little bit, Kate, if you want to start? I mean, in your work, what role do you see that social inequality and poverty has in modifying or being affected by these disease risks?
Yeah, I think it plays a really, really important role. And I think it's easy to overlook this as a disease ecologist. You kind of tend to think about the disease in the host and think about the pathways to humans and how, different drivers will exacerbate that spillover risk. But actually, you really have to think in a much more joined up way about human socioeconomics as well. So that kind of exposure part of the model, and critically susceptibility, is really really a key part of that human dynamics and that human part of that framework. So susceptibility, plays a huge role, and it could be that there are interacting effects as well. So you could have land use change marginalizing different populations, so they have poorer access to health facilities, for example. Or it could be climate change also has that same effect, like they're more vulnerable. They've been, they're less resilient. They've had more shocks, and they're less resilient. So, kind of on a kind of more broader scale, you've got the susceptibility issues being apparent to large-scale drivers like land use change and climate change, but also, of course, you've got inequality, social inequality, exacerbating those effects as well, which I'm less of an expert on, but that would all interact with with the susceptibility measure when we're trying to model effects.
What would you say, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, and I mean, it was called the rich man's disease in many low and middle income countries in the beginning, right? And then clearly the capacity of people in different income groups to isolate themselves, stay away from work, I mean, is very different, and people that have a less of a certain safe income don't have those opportunities, right? So they are much more at risk in the longer term. So I think you can right now think about it as you have some people spreading it around the world, and others maybe that are more vulnerable once it spreads within a country. As those are the two groups.
I'm going to jump to a totally different topic now. It's related, of course. But I think this is a question to Kate. So one of the things that I noted when I got to know you was that you love bats. You're a huge bat lover. And of course, I mean, talking about the coronavirus, it's been at least linked to bats in particular. I know you've thought a lot about this, Kate. Do you want to elaborate a little bit? You're a big bat fan.
I love bats, so I'm not going to say anything bad about them. I think they're fascinating and completely uniquely adapted, and just have some incredible evolutionary changes that have happened to them, which just make them endlessly fascinating to me and to many other people. But I would say that they have been implicated in a number of emerging infectious diseases, and I don't know exactly if that's just because they're kind of high profile, and they some people listen to the myths about them being evil or getting in your hair, and people they've got a bad PR, so that if you hear about a bat in an emerging disease pathway, that might be kind of over exaggerated in people's minds. Or it could also be that bats are special in terms of the pathogens. So there have been a few studies on the number of pathogens that bats have compared to other mammals, and the jury is still slightly arguing with each other. But that it's probably because there's just a lot of bat species and they've got a lot of pathogens. So they don't have more in proportion than, say, other mammal groups like rodents, for example. And rodents are also responsible for a lot of emerging infectious diseases.
We're running out of time. Time flies. So
To
I'm
talk about.
just going to wrap up with a question to both of you. I mean, this pod is a little about trying to make sense of what's happening at the moment. And I know you both love to read, or I assume at least. Is there any book that you would recommend to our listeners and viewers to try to make sense and understand what's happening now? Peter, do you want to go first?
Yeah, actually, I think I brought it in my bag. Sorry if I'm going to make some noise. Let's see. Oh, yeah, here it is. It's actually called the Stockholm Paradigm.
Thank you.
There. But I think what's fascinating about it, it takes an evolutionary perspective on evolution of clearly parasites and hosts, and how host range, so how many species you can infect and things like that, change over time, and just how dynamic it is. So the reason I want to recommend it is not because it has Stockholm in its title, but it's because it really talks to the dynamic nature of the biosphere, including infectious disease and other pathogens. But let's not forget, as Kate said, this is a small part of the living matter on Earth, right? But yeah, this would be the one.
Kate, what about you?
I would say that to see the bigger picture of where this pandemic fits and how to recover from this as a global society, which is fairer, more sustainable, and looks after our planetary health, I would recommend Kate Rayworth's book on donut economics. I think that is a really interesting take on how we can transform our thinking about economics and the economy into one which understands the intrinsic value of ecosystem services and nature's contribution to people. So I think that's not come from an ecologist, that's come from an economist, and I think that's really inspired me to to think more broadly about the work that I'm doing and put it into context of how we could go forward into the future.
Beautiful. Lovely last words from Kate. Thank you very much to both for joining.
Thank you.
This talk, and hope to connect soon. IRL, as the kids say. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.